Hello, this is Desmon Butts, Gyro CFI, ATP Captain, and today we're going to talk about mountain flying. Okay, I'm going to attempt to explain a little bit about what's going on here in the drawing. This is representation of the mountains that surround the Ogden and Brigham City, Utah area. I'm using this area as my example because I actually have some footage of me flying along a set of mountains that have kind of some similarities to this depiction that I used with Play-Doh. In the valley up there between Salt Lake City and northern Utah, they have the very large Salt Lake, famously called the Great Salt Lake. And it has promontory mountains that actually are about right here. I didn't put those in. And it has the Salt Lake itself and then the flats that go this direction to the west over toward Windover. Because this is such a broad area and it's low, anywhere the valley and the bases of these mountains range anywhere from 4,000 to 5,000 or so feet in elevation in these areas. You have a lot of surface area that gets heated up in the flat area, and the prevailing winds usually go toward the east and hit these mountains. These mountains are in the way and cause a lifting effect because the air has nowhere to go. The hot air wants to rise. It comes against the mountains. It rises up usually through these little tiny chutes in the mountains, and these aren't defined very well. They're kind of hard to see, but usually the air hits these, concentrates in the broad area, and channels up like a chimney through these little chutes. This is very common on most mountains where they have different air patterns. In this particular case, the warm air rises, cools off, and of course more air is coming from below to keep pushing it up. The hot air comes up the front, creates a ridge lift, and runs up these small mini canyon chutes up the front faces of the mountains. As it reaches the ridge line, it tends to have a sink rate on the bottom. So you have a lifting action across the front where all the heated air draws, goes up toward the mountains, creates a lift. And on the backside, as it cools, it descends on the backside or the east side of this particular mountain range. Part of this is also aided by the fact that there are pockets on the other side of these mountains that are higher elevation than the huge valley floor below that consists of the Salt Lake City, Ogden and Provo, Brigham City area in this range right here. When you have the denser, cooler air on the backside of the mountain settles in these pockets up here, they have nowhere to go, and there's another range behind. Most of the time they don't go over that range as easily as the hot air from the main valley floor came up over the front. So they puddle up in here and flow down the canyons. This particular mountain here is representation of a cut-through pass that a river runs between these sets of mountains. This mountain are joined here. They don't allow the air to flow through this canyon. However, I don't have enough Play-Doh, but there's another range right here, and this lake area here would cool the air, bring it down, and it would flow down this major canyon here like it does this canyon. This area here might have a little bit lower pocket. It'll come through here and flow out on this side. So when you're flying along these mountains and you want to do mountain flying, one, you got to know the topography. You got to know your area. You got to understand what the currents generally are doing. I'm just using this as a basic illustration of what it prevailingly does in this area. Under normal conditions, it'll flow from this large valley here, go up the face of the mountains, and then drop down. What does this mean to you as a pilot? Well, when you're flying along these mountains, normally you want to cross the tops of these peaks, especially if you don't know what's going on, probably a couple thousand feet above the top of these peaks, because you're going to have a very noticeable amount of lift on this face here, where the wind's coming up and pushing up. We call that ridge lift. Sometimes I use that to help actually gain altitude along the face. So I might fly along this way, never toward the mountain, because you're never going to outclimb the altitude. So you want to be along the side and pick up the lift. The lift will actually give you an accelerated ability to climb, flying along the face of the mountain in this direction or the other direction, and avoid the canyon. So for instance, when I get close to a canyon like this, usually I'm going to go away from it because prevailingly the wind's going to be blowing down the canyon. where the lift is going to be coming up the face of the mountains and up the chutes. If I'm along the top of the ridge, I'm going to be probably 1,000 foot or more above the tops of these, because when you get on the back side of them, there is an appreciable amount of sink on the back side of these mountains, because the air that's coming up is getting cooled off and it tends to settle on the backside and then rush down these canyons. Because predominantly there's a lot of wind blowing down these canyons, you don't want to get caught in that turbulence that comes down these canyons in this area, especially down here. Some of these canyon winds, especially in the Weber Canyon area that's in between Salt Lake City and Ogden, the winds can be sustained almost on a daily basis of over 50 knots. So you want to be careful about those large canyons when you're in that area. You want to cross them at a higher altitude. On the backside, you also want to come this direction, at least a couple thousand feet above these if you're going to cross them and go into this valley, because there's going to be a huge amount of sink right here. And even experienced pilots, when they fly over these mountains, if they go over a little bit low, will be caught in a sink that they cannot climb out of. And if they're up in here, it's almost boxed off to the point where they have no out. They have no way to get out of these canyons, and they end up circling in here, trying to maybe get above them, or if it's IMC, they crash into the side of them, or they crash into the lake or somewhere else on the inside of those mountain ranges. So it's better to cross peak to peak. Take a look at your sectional maps, know your topographical area that you're flying in, and avoid those types of situations. One last thing I want to make sure that I point out is that mountain flying and high altitude flying sometimes go together, sometimes they don't. So if you're flying down, say, on the oceans anywhere, take California area, the way that those ocean currents work and the way they affect of flow and air currents on the mountains, you need to be familiar with your area. You need to understand what's going on there. Also in California, you're not going to have the performance issues you might if you are taking off in, say, Colorado or the Utah area, because you're already starting at a disadvantage at high altitude, where if you're taking off, say, in San Diego or LA or Santa Barbara, you have better performance because you're right close to sea level. Even in Alaska, where I learned to fly up by Palmer, Alaska, that was only about 100 feet above sea level. So we had good performance generally, even though we still had to deal with the mountain currents and things like this. In Utah, you have poor performance because you're starting out at a mile high already, and sometimes density altitude is 7,000 feet. And so it's going to make the learning and understanding of the currents through the mountains and the air circulation of that even much more critical, because you're going to top these mountains, and even the mountain might be 10,000 feet high, the density altitude might be higher than that. So you got to be careful to understand your topography, where you're at, the conditions you're going to be flying in, and the performance data on the aircraft. Where you cross a mountain high peak in Utah, Colorado at around that 10,000 foot range, the valley floor distance might be, say, a 5,000 foot distance. So if you're a mile high on the valley floor and you're going up over 10,000 foot peak, the mountain's only 10,000 feet from the valley floor. However, if you're at in ocean level in Alaska or, say, California or Oregon, anywhere like that, those peaks might be about 5,000 feet from the ocean floor, which means your performance to cross over those mountains is a lot easier than crossing them in the high Rockies. The reason why this is important is if you go, well, I fly mountains all the time. I'm down by the coast. I'm in an area where there's lots of mountains. It means that you don't understand the high altitude combination of mountain flying that happens with people that are familiar with flying in them in, say, Colorado or Utah, Idaho, some of those type of places there where they're starting off at a high density altitude in the first place and they have limited performance to start with. So you want to make sure that you know those things, keep all of those variables in effect before you start planning cross countries over areas that are mountainous, whether you have experience in them at the coast or not. Because if you're flying a lot of the coastal mountains, like I said, it's going to differ than mountain flying when you fly in the inland areas that have high mountains, say Montana, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, Nevada, any of those places that have those high peaks there and high density altitude that make a more profound effect on the way that mountain flying can work. As a general rule, just make sure that where you're flying in the mountains, you research the currents, you understand the limitations of your aircraft, and know some basics on how the wind and air usually flows. One thing that you also need to make sure of is you understand cloud formations and what they look like. I have a picture of a standing lenticular cloud over the top of a mountain range. Usually those mean that the winds are so high that you don't even want to go there in the first place. So you want to make sure you understand your weather, local surroundings. If you see those lenticular clouds, live and fly another day. Okay, what you are seeing here is a pretty good photo of a lenticular cloud. When you see this over the mountains where you might want to fly, usually a lenticular cloud is a sign of very high winds and turbulence, and it's best not even to go there. This is a shot of the sectional of the Great Salt Lake area where I'm depicting these mountains to be. Now obviously the crude model of the mountains isn't perfectly depicted on the sectional. However, you'll notice that down in this area is where the Great Salt Lake is. This is Brigham City. Everything above on this side is showing higher altitude, 10,400 feet on the peaks here, 10,100 here. The valley floor down here is anywhere between 4,000 and 5,000 depending on where you're at. Usually the airflow is going to go from the lower, where it can get warmer areas, and rise up against the mountains, then cool off over on the higher altitude areas and settle on those areas. In this particular case, usually the wind flows are coming from the west side going toward the east, running up against the mountain range here, and after crossing the mountain range they cool off into the higher elevation valleys up in the top, and then the air currents will flow down the canyons. This is an actual flight going over the area that has been described. It also shows one of the mountain lakes and a beautiful waterfall canyon that we'll fly down. Enjoy. This is Desmon Butts. I hope you like this video. Like it, subscribe, and by no means is this perfect. It just gives you a basic overview of some of the things that I understand about basics in mountain flying.